And welcome to the webinar. Now, this is by the Built a Whole Venture Design Lab. As you know, this is first of a two-part on a intentionally provocative topic of how lean startup plus patient capital set impact ventures up to fail and what to do about it. And it wasn't to be provocative just for the sake of it, but in our view, it's really about trying to help jolt, be the word I use, the impact venture sector out of what feels like kind of an autopilot mode that's developed. From our view, it's following this innovation playbook that was developed for a very different game, and it's showing up in the scoreboard in terms of the really, really low success rates that we see. And the focus of this webinar is to help people understand that when you're building ventures with the goal of creating scaled and lasting commercial solutions to big problems, you just have to approach the innovation process really differently than someone who's building a venture to exit, and I'll say like a quote conventional VC fund. And that's because the financial constraints you're working under are just completely different. And so today, we're going to unpack the financial constraints. We're going to look at how they relate to that innovation playbook and explore really kind of what's the problem that it's creating for impact ventures. So it's great to see some old faces and wonderful to see some new ones. My name is Eric Samanis, for those who don't know me, and I've got two hats. I'm co-director of this venture of our lab, the Venture Design Lab, and I'll tell you a bit more about it in just a bit. I'm also founder of a venture design firm that's called Half Solved, and our name tips its hat to that engineering saying that a problem well defined is a problem half solved. And over the past 30 years, hard to believe, the problem I've been trying to solve is innovating new market-creating ventures profitably. And that's the word I really want to emphasize. Ones that can solve big challenges commercially at scale and deliver commercial returns. And I was drawn into this space working on my MBA in the late 90s when the whole bottom of the pyramid concept was bubbling up. And it led to a stint in a new venture team inside Monsanto that was focused on bringing profitable solutions to smallholder farmers. That then transitioned into a doctoral program at Cornell focused on market creation. And during and after that program, I was running a lab at Cornell where we were building ventures and testing a methodology in field with DuPont, SC Johnson, Ascension Health, P&G, Sightsavers. And that turned into co-founding a venture incubation company where we took the methodology and the learnings and we ended up guiding over like a couple dozen impact ventures just across a whole range of industries for Barclays, BMW, Pearson, Unilever, Disney, Mars, as well as in the clean tech sector in emerging markets. And through all of that, I believe we've really defined the problem really well. Failure has a way of focusing the mind. And we've unpacked the science. Really feel like there's a science that we haven't understood behind profitable venture creation and developed a methodology that I believe could create a real step change in success rates. And Half Solved and the lab were both created to put the science and this practice out into the world. So just one brief word about the lab. So the lab, it's a partnership between Half Solved, the Center for Sustainable Global Enterprise at Cornell, and INCOSE, the International Council on Systems Engineering. INCOSE is a partner as the methodology that we were grounded in is based in systems engineering. And the mission of the lab is to advance and disseminate the science and the methodology. And there's two main thrusts. There's training, we do workshops, courses, webinars like this one that are meant to just introduce people to the method. And then there's applied research projects. One that I would highlight is with the MIT Alumni Angels Network, where we're trying to take the science for building and kind of flip it on its head and use it for venture screening and due diligence. So there were going to be three of us that were going to be tag teaming the session today, but unfortunately, the third person on the screen here, Adil Saxena, he's had an emergency and just can't make it today. He'll be with us next week. But what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to hand off to Patrick in just a little bit, maybe in 15 or so minutes after I run through some content, and I'll let him do a proper introduction at that point. And the time that we were going to have with Adil, we wanted to have him just share some of his own kind of reflections on what we'd be presenting. He just has a really interesting perspective. We met just not that long ago, but he's had a foot in both in kind of starting a BOP venture in Kenya that exited. He's worked on the development side at World Bank, the UN, And then he's also been working on the VC side. So he's got this really interesting kind of perspective. Quick note just on process, just to give him the challenges of the webinar structure. If you have any questions or comments, if you would just drop them into the chat. So we'll keep track of things as we're going. And if it's something that we can just jump in and address kind of on the spot, we will. We're going to have some discussion time at the end. And whatever we just don't get to in the webinar, we'll do our best to write up some answers and do follow up afterwards. So with it, let's go ahead and jump into the content. Okay, so we got 2 core sessions. Today's all about just understanding the problem. We're going to look under the proverbial hood and really pick apart why so many impact ventures. They launch, they get some customers, struggle with profits, and they either close or they stay in this kind of quasi non-profity stage. Next Thursday will be about the solution, so it'll feel like a real, hopefully, a breath of fresh air from the negative kind of vibes that may come from today. But we'll share a really different way of approaching the innovation challenge that ventures present. And I'm going to kick off with a few slides about the fundamental innovation challenge behind the ventures, and that's going to set the stage for Patrick. And then I'll jump in back at the end. Just as a heads up, I'm going to introduce a few kind of key, but they're really just new and different concepts. We don't have a lot of time, and it's one of those things where if we could go and spend, run through just a number of examples, really kind of sit with these concepts, it's what you need to really kind of understand and absorb it. But again, the focus of the session, it's not about teaching these new concepts. It's really just to give you the storyline. So I appreciate that it may feel like we're covering a lot of new stuff and moving pretty fast. So the first thing, just to be clear, we're all on the same, but what do we mean by market creation and where do impact ventures fit into that? So when we say market creation, we mean any ventures that bring new core functionality into the world. It's solutions that they just bring capabilities, new capabilities into customers' hands. To use Clay Christensen's phrasing around this, it's solutions that let customers perform jobs they previously couldn't. And impact ventures, they're a subset of those, and they're trying to do one of 2 things. Either they're focused on bringing some new core functionality specifically to low-income consumers, the BOP, or they're trying to take and use that core functionality to solve some persistent social or environmental challenge like climate change. So it's really about the intent of what they're trying to solve. And both of these things can be true at the same time as well. And just to be clear, it's a really technical use of the term impact here. I'm not saying that ventures that fall outside of this, they're not impactful. On the contrary, I believe that all market creating ventures just generate really valuable impact for customers. It's why people spend their money on new products and services. So there's a place here where it gets a little murky whether something is a true impact venture or not. But so the picture that I've got here, the images on the left-hand side, I would classify these as, quote, market creating ventures that aren't necessarily seen as impact ventures, while those on the right are. So the microwave brought this capability for people to cook food quickly, conveniently, using a lot less energy, using radio waves. Again, not really considered an impact, but certainly held a lot of value to people, as well as some of these positive externalities it had on the energy side. Whereas on the right-hand side, we've got the biomass cook stove. So specifically trying to solve for consumers, low-income consumers, otherwise burning hazardous wood. And then we've got like the Diners Club card, the first consumer credit card, which kind of made paying for things when you're traveling just super much easier. Again, not considered impact venture, but certainly held real transformative value in people's lives. Whereas the microfinance innovation of getting small working capital loans to low-income unbanked people, roundly considered impact. And then lastly, in the lower left here, we've got kind of the bioengineered seeds that were built in kind of pest and herbicide resistance. Breakthrough, saved farmers a lot of money via better yields, lowered herbicide usage, particularly like if you look at cotton. Generally not thought of as like an impact venture, whereas kind of on the plant-based meat industry, where the idea of being able to address a lot of the greenhouse gases and the climate change that come from the whole meat production, just where there's enormous potential environmental and nutritional gains. that's kind of typically roundly considered as impact. But again, just to give you a sense of what we mean by impact is a more kind of a technical framing around it. So when you get down to like, what fundamentally are we trying to solve for? Like, what is the biggest, most critical innovation problem? This is how we've defined it. We call it, there is always a cost to value barrier that's prevented a market from having already been created. And what we mean by that in the most simplest term is the cost of trying to solve the problem is just greater than the value that can be created. It's why this persistent societal problem persists in the first place, and why there isn't a commercial solution for the BOP. It's not because someone hasn't tried it or thought about trying to solve it. So, I mean, if you take something like our classic Henry Ford, the father of, if you will, of the modern auto industry, Ford didn't come up with the idea of a car. Cars were around, but at the time they took the form of a luxury recreational vehicle. Cost $1,500 at that time. Ford wanted to get that core functionality, and you could think of it as like mobility via an engine-powered carriage. He wanted to get that into the lives of the mass market of rural consumers, so the bottom of the pyramid of the U.S. at the time. But to do that, that price needed to come down to $300. So there was this enormous value barrier that was preventing that functionality from already being in the mass market. Key question is, well, if we keep talking about there's this barrier, like, where does the barrier actually sit? And this is the question that literally took me, I feel like this was a 10-year journey to really understand this dynamic. So the answer, okay, go over there. So the answer is that the cost to value barrier sits in what we call the default core business architecture. I'm going to explain first what I mean by the core business architecture, and then we're going to get to the issue of default. But we're using the term architecture in a true kind of engineering sense of the word. So in a business context, the core business architecture, think of it, it's the DNA of the market or industry. So it operates at the level of the overall industry, the sandbox that all the companies in an industry are operating and playing inside of. And what is it? It's actually comprised of, it's just a tight bundle of core integrated strategies. And those strategies, they code, if you will, for how that core functionality is ultimately commercialized. So it's like this bundle of DNA that ends up getting shared by all the other competitors. And the thing is, the core business architecture plays these two really key roles. It does two key things for all the companies in the industry. First, it defines the basic shape of the product and operations. We call it, just together, kind of the business form factor. It's why GM, Ford, Stellantis, and all the other companies, if you zoom out far enough, they all look alike. There's something common and similar to them. It's the core business architecture. The second thing the architecture does is that it establishes and defines the industry's cost curve and the value curve. And in so doing, it sets the ceiling on how much value you can create and also a floor on your unit cost. So it's why, again, going back to the auto industry, why everybody's got very different business models, but all those auto manufacturers' gross margins always fluctuate between 16 and 20%. 5-year average net profit margins are always between 3 and 7%. It's because they're operating within a defined performance curve. So when we say, let me pop over here. The business model is what operates, it's a firm level construct. It is, every company has its own business model, and it's how each company chooses to compete within the business form factor and the cost and value curves set by the architecture. So it is solving for each firm's individual profitability within the potential profitability that exists. And what it does, it fills out, if the architecture provides the basic form, it's the business model that provides all the detail. It details out each firm's specific product design, how they organize their value chain, how they choose to focus their capabilities, what aspects they want to emphasize more or less. Okay. So when we ultimately say that it's the core business, when we ultimately say that it's the cost to value barrier sits in the architecture, we mean it's sitting in this DNA for how the whole industry operates, in this bundle of just core strategies. And in Ford's case, the core business architecture for that luxury recreation vehicle, at the time it was using highly skilled craftspeople, hand building customized solutions for wealthy people, and operation and maintenance was provided by personal mechanics who are also doubling as chauffeurs. So sorry, I'm having problems with my, there we go. Let me toggle now over to that other part about the idea of defaulting, a default core business architecture. So as we were implied kind of a few slides ago, there isn't some existing core business architecture to get some new core functionality into the world profitably. If it did, the market would already exist. But what ends up happening, and I believe this is almost like some kind of a force of nature. There's something just inherently natural. It's like gravity. It's that our minds, they anchor on existing core business architectures and form factors that just most naturally fit or map onto the core functionality we want to commercialize. And if it doesn't come from the entrepreneur or founder, it is going to come from the customer doing customer research. It's the idea behind Ford's famous quote that Jobs repurposed that said, if I had asked the customer what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And this is what we mean by kind of the default core business architecture. It's this one that we're just pulled to just naturally. So when we see a hazardous kerosene lantern, in use in Kenya, in a Kenyan slum or village, the idea of a portable solar-powered household electronic appliance, it just really comes naturally to mind because that architecture already exists for that kind of functionality. Similarly, when we see kind of iron deficient young ladies in a low-income rural community, the idea of, all right, some kind of a fortified packaged food form factor naturally comes to mind. And when we see, rural health mental challenges where, there's mental health care just isn't present, we just naturally go to like one-on-one online care, healthcare by mental health professionals. It's just this natural movement between I see a problem and I already have these kind of schemas in my mind for solutions. So what ends up happening is this default core business architecture and form factor end up getting backdoored into the venture. Now, the problem is that when you import that default core business architecture into this new context, it doesn't work. And it's because there are key enabling conditions that have to be present for it to work. And they end up being violated. It's kind of the taking the fish out of the water problem. So, a portable consumer electronics business architecture and a fortified packaged foods architecture, they work as long as your customers already intuitively understand the value the product offers. They've already learned the product routines that you need to use the product properly to get the value out of it. They already have room in their budgets that are allocated to it. When all those boundary conditions are violated, which they are when you go to the bottom of the pyramid markets, your customer acquisition costs, customer churn, they go through the roof. And suddenly, that just overwhelms the margin structure that, again, inherently comes with those core business architectures. And so the result is that we drive up the unit cost curve at the architecture level beyond the value you can actually create. And the moment that happens, it's like there is no business model that you're going to find experimenting and trying to optimize. There is no point that thing is going to exist, no matter how much you experiment and test with it. And so this is, that issue is just cross-cutting. It's not just an impact ventures thing, but what happens in the impact venture space, it's made even more severe. And it's because, you look at bottom of the pyramid markets, you're dealing with just inherently far lower quality infrastructure. And I mean in the broadest sense, you got poor transport infrastructure, you got poor comms infrastructure, payment infrastructure, educational infrastructure, and all of that. It just creates a very high cost operating environment relative to the customer's purchasing power. And then with ventures that are targeting big societal problems like climate change and malnutrition and poor health, the problem there is that the problems and the consequences, they're just really widely diffused. And that ends up kind of diluting the value that can be created for any one actor. And, it's the tragedy of the commons kind of issue where, a problem that affects everybody, doesn't really affect anyone. All right. I know we covered a lot of key concepts, but again, hold on to just some of the main storyline here. I'm going to hand off now to Patrick, and he's going to start unlocking kind of the flaws and how impact ventures are wittingly or not, innovating today. There we go.
Oh, second. Thank you, Eric. Yeah, just a quick background on me. My career has mirrored Eric's in a lot of ways, and sometimes gone alongside him. I started as an engineer, studying as a computer scientist, working at actually Apple and in an artificial intelligence lab for Rockwell International. But then I joined Eric in his work, doing his base of the pyramid work in Kenya and India. We worked together in Michigan. There's work I was doing in Brazil, Eric in Ghana. So we worked together for a number of years, trying to create these base of the pyramid ventures that would, essentially create new markets to bring new impact into the world. Um, I then went on also to work on my own and created a couple of my own social enterprises, and then later led early stage products and innovation efforts at companies like Facebook and Automatic, and went on to and continue to coach and advise leaders at companies around the world, including at Anthropic, OpenAI, Flatiron Health, and a number of others. So a lot of what we're talking about is stuff that I personally experienced both in the impact space, but also in some of these, some of these companies that we look at as defining or showing us the way to build companies. And a lot of these are very personal experiences for me. And so what I want to talk about, what I want to transition to is talking about today's dominant venture building paradigm, which is something, just to be clear, both Eric and I, on our own, we're following this path as well when we're doing that work internationally, but also since then. And the dominant venture building paradigm today is lean startup. It's a paradigm which really emerged from the Silicon Valley playbook in the world of venture capital. Whether you know the name or not, you like to say it or not, it's highly likely that you're using lean startup as your venture building process, or that the ventures you're investing in are using it. It's ubiquitous. And at the heart of the lean startup paradigm is this statement. It's about organizations that are focused on, one, searching for a repeatable and scalable business model, and under two, extreme uncertainty. So it's about searching under extreme uncertainty. That's how lean startup approaches the venture building process. Go ahead. Now, people start using lean startup in varying ways, but at its core, people building ventures with lean startup all follow a very similar process. You may start with an idea or concept, but then the process centers on the concept of customer discovery. That is, using insights from customers to guide your search. And so you talk to customers to help you refine your idea and to choose a beachhead, a place to start. And then you build a minimal viable product to launch into market. You launch the MVP into a beachhead, and then you take what you learned from the MVP to, as rapidly as you can, iterate through a build, test, learn loop, and to achieve product market fit, which is the concept of finding a product that achieves rapid, sustainable customer adoption. Keep going ahead, Eric. And if you achieve product market fit, then you continue experimenting and iterating and testing until you can do it all profitably. But if you can't achieve product market fit, or really if you start to run out of money, you pivot, you go back to the drawing board with your customers. So the heart of it is that the world is uncertain. And the answer to that uncertainty is to focus on customer needs. And the only true way to know if you are satisfying customer needs is to build solutions, put them into the hands of your customers. That's the heart of the lean startup method. Keep going. They're really the epitome of lean startup. The heart of it, again, is this image, this analogy of trying to build a plane while flying it. Which in the startup world, I'm in San Francisco, in the midst of the startup culture here. Here, it's really considered a mark of having real startup. It's a mark of honor, or the idea of having real startup hustle. I'm not waiting for an answer. I'm moving fast, and I'm building the plane while I'm flying it. But it's a terrifying concept if you stop and think about it. It's also, if you study repeat founders, is also not what they tend to do. but we'll come back to that. You go on. So with all of this, there's some de facto investment parameters that arise with lean startup. You have an extremely high failure rate. If you define success as achieving profitability, so it's less, we'll talk a little bit about where this data comes from, but we estimate less than 2% are achieving profitability. You have a really long validation time to achieve that success, and very often way more than 10 years. And you have to suffer significant and persistent losses along the way, more than 40% of your revenue. Now, a note on on these stats. Well, no one really tracks success rates in terms of profitability, which in and of itself is a pretty telling concept. We've been able to extrapolate these statistics using data from Startup Genome and by reviewing public company performance. So looking at post-IPO data. And the result we get in terms of success rate is a dismal 1 to 5%, or as estimated, around 2% or less. And it could actually be a lot worse than that. Keep going. Given that context, given those investment parameters and those challenges, let's take a deeper dive on the why of the problem, what structurally drives these low success rates. And so from our research and also our work with dozens of ventures innovation programs, we have two key insights. One is that the low success rates and the long, costly validation times, they're not actually natural to venture creation. They're structural to lean startup. And the way the method approaches the innovation challenge actually creates the financial outcomes that we're seeing. It's what creates those parameters. Let's go into the next slide, and we're talking specifically about why this happens. So what is it that's driving the low probability of success? There are three key structural drivers to lean startups' low success rate. The first is the idea of open-ended idea generation. It seems open, but actually without an explicit criteria, invariably people anchor from where they are. Sorry, letting someone in. From where they already are, or what they already know, or who they know. You can see this advice from Jared Freeman of Y Combinator on how you're encouraged to start. Where do you come up with your ideas? They tell you to look for an idea based on what you're good at, things you wish someone would build for you already, what you would be excited to work on. These are all places you can start, yes, but if commercial sustainability, if profitability is a goal, why would you start there? So open-ended idea generation without assessing the profitability potential or the means to do so makes you susceptible working at dead ends or in local optimums without sufficient monetizability. So I say local optimums because it's in computer science, we have the concept of hill climbing algorithms, which are used to find the highest point in a global region, the so-called global optimum. But hill climbing algorithms are highly disadvantaged if you start in the wrong place, just as iterative approaches to venture building are. So you need both an objective function to determine if you're moving in the right direction towards monetizability, but it also means you also need a means to make sure you're not choosing a poor starting point. So ultimately with open-ended idea generation, you invariably start with an idea that's already got a problem baked into it, and then you lean into it and it just makes it worse. Your monetizability gets worse. All this, again, hurts your ability to monetize and therefore reach commercial sustainability. The second driver is that you're anchoring around customer needs with lean startup. The challenge here is epitomized by the quote that Eric brought up earlier. If I asked a customer what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. So a core challenge of market creation is that customers are rooted in their current reality and routines. They're frequently blind to the big problems or opportunities. Anchoring yourself to customer needs also leads to anchor yourself to areas with low monetizability. This often leads to ideas that are more annoyances with low value versus the big step change in value that you really need to create a high probability of success. You also end up as Eric was saying earlier, you end up backdooring in the default architecture, the solar-powered lanterns, the solar-powered refrigerators, etc. You foreclose the ability to create the viable architecture that you actually need. And the final driver is you build your product to be optimized for the customer. Now, on the surface, this seems like a good thing, right? But any systems engineer will caution you that optimizing for a single function invariably pessimizes an entire system. And a successful venture is a system. Yes, one that needs to create value for customers, but also one that needs to deliver other critical functions with as efficient as a cost structure as possible. The epitome of this in the venture world is examples like WeWork, which delivered tremendous customer value. It was a startup office with the flexibility of a co-working space. Someone that started up ventures, the idea of being able to have essentially the home for my company, but not have these upfront costs or not these recurring costs was incredible. But WeWork had a completely untenable cost structure. Let's go on to the next one. So from these strategies, you have these knock-on effects. And you see this graph again, which Eric introduced us to earlier. By pushing down the monetizable value and driving up your cost structure, you narrow and potentially foreclose a path to profitability from the very start. There's no amount of time and experimentation that will land on a profitable business model if your cost curve is higher than your value curve, which can frequently happen if you inadvertently bring in an existing architecture versus focusing on the architecture that you need. And if you click ahead, we have some examples of ventures and nascent markets that suffered from these profitability drivers. No amount of optimization and iteration would make them commercially viable. All of these have struggled. They've done well in terms of meeting customer needs, driving so-called product market fit, but they've all struggled with profitability and therefore commercial scale. Let's go ahead. So there are also two structural drivers that lead to long, costly validation timelines as you search for a profitable business model. The first, again, is open-ended experimentation, where you're building and testing without a well-defined performance and profitability requirements. If you don't question which way is north or have the ability to assess which way is north, you're unlikely to reach your destination anytime soon. And of course, here, your destination is a commercial engine that can sustainably deliver impact. The second is lean startups' reliance on learning live in market. Well, there are some things you can only validate live. Going live introduces tremendous complexity. It obscures root causes and it has big ripple effects across your entire operation. It also anchors you to a form factor that becomes more and more costly to change. Anyone that's been in the startup space, if you've worked on ventures, you know that pivoting is increasingly expensive the further along you go. This is particularly true if you move out of the world of lean startups origins, which is SaaS software. And if you move into the realms of manufacturing, physical distribution, or regulation, any of these worlds where it becomes increasingly difficult to change what you're doing and to pivot. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So we're going to take a brief dive into once seemingly promising, but ultimately failure of market creation. And that's subscription meal kits. And I'm going to talk particularly about Blue Apron, but it's worth noting that this wasn't only a Blue Apron problem. Every subscription meal kit company had suffered from similar problems. This includes ones that had a social impact mission, delivering healthy, nutritious foods to people in need, or ones focused on creating more value for farmers by cutting out middlemen. And the latter would include one of my own ventures. And so for Blue Apron, they actually had really strong product market fit. In 2016, Blue Apron shipped almost 3 million meal kits per month. It was, a lot of us used it. It was everywhere. But at its core, it was ultimately delivering a time-saving convenience, which had low monetizability and ended up in high churn. Using a subscription meal kit product idea as a way to help families put healthy dinners on the table, it created distribution and logistics problems with high perishability of pre-cut, fresh meats and vegetables. It created a huge sales and marketing challenge of having to convince customers that paying $10 for ingredients that cost $4 at a grocery store was worth that minimal time savings that you were getting. And it created the retention challenge of hanging on to customers who were offered free sign-on meal kits by competitors, or who were really only there for the free meals to begin with, or the low-cost meals. And to their credit, Blue Apron iterated relentlessly to work around these issues. They tried delivery through grocery stores. But that opened them up to competing alongside every other food option in the store, and also compromised the time savings value proposition that they had. They expanded to 50 meal options. They partnered with celebrity chefs. They attempted strategic partnerships across healthcare, fitness, e-commerce, and beyond. They moved to an automated distribution center. They sourced ingredients, again, directly from farmers, so they didn't have to deal with middlemen. None of it worked. Eventually, they were acquired at a massive loss, and after accumulating hundreds of millions of dollars in losses. So given all of this, why does anybody follow lean startup? Like, where does it work? Can you move ahead? Well, it turns out it works really, really well for VC funds. With high uncertainty, VC funds are able to make lots of bets to diversify the risks. And then here's the key. They can exit and sell the venture off on a multiple of revenue early on, while the venture is still unprofitable. Company takes 15 years to get to profitability, it's okay, because we sold our stake at year 7, with all those future profits or the future value already built in. And the truth, in fact, a VC fund can generate strong returns for their fund, even if none of the portfolio companies ever turn a profit. They're already out by year 6 or 7. And if you're a monopoly player, you get, you'll get the reference in this card. It's essentially like a get out of jail free card, and it's a card that can be kept until it's needed, or it can be sold. This is how venture capital funds can use lean startup to generate returns. Let's go on to the next slide and we'll look through some examples of this. There's a number of them. You look at first round capital's investment into Uber. They took a $1.5 million investment and turned it into a $2.6 billion in profit for the fund. But Uber's operating losses were $1 billion at their IPO and $10 billion. They're $1 billion at the IPO with $10 billion in losses. The losses reached $33 billion by 2023. Snapchat, same thing. For Lightspeed Ventures, $485,000 into a $2 billion exit for them. But their operating losses were for the company itself were $550 million at the IPO, $1.2 billion, in losses, and then again losses grew and grew. And you see the same here for Dropbox and Beyond Meat. Beyond Meat, $1.5 million into $1.3 billion 4 years later. Beyond Meat, had $130 million in cumulative losses at their IPO, and they reached $600 million by 2025. So these venture funds, that they were able to make these bets and achieve tremendous success. But if you look at the economics of the company underneath, there were massive losses that were still being generated. And this is, but they're able to, they're able to monetize it by getting out earlier. You go ahead, Eric. So this leads us to talk about like the big misconception about what lean startup is for. Just flip through. Yep. So lean startup isn't a VC innovation strategy for creating new enduringly profitable companies. It's not. It's their investment strategy for generating profits for the fund with this 10-year life. And product market fit, what drives lean startup, it's the KPI that drives VC fund returns. It is the most important element of a VC fund returns. Can you achieve hyper growth? Can you satisfy our customer needs so much that propped up with with a highly risk tolerant, failure tolerant venture capital, you can achieve hyper growth and therefore push them into a valuation that's really high, and then you can exit with it. And if you look at it from the perspective, just even VCs will note this. It's a power law game. Like 97% of exits come from a very small number of profits come from a very small number of firms. And they structure their investments in such a way that they can still make money even with these high failure rates. They push all the ventures in the portfolio for hyper growth to achieve product market fit, to get that big exit opportunity for them. And then it doesn't matter if most of them fail along the way. And obviously, it matters to other people. Like it matters if you're one of those entrepreneurs that didn't get that, weren't able to get that experience, that exit. Or it matters if you're trying to follow this playbook, but you're not a VC fund. Can you tolerate those high failure rates? Let's keep going. The other piece to note, and we just want to say, is lean startup can also be really great for improving or optimizing products. Particularly if a commercially viable core business architecture already exists, or where implicit financial and operational parameters can bound their customer research and product design, you can use the iterative approach of lean startup to really extend your business. Well, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about bringing new function into people's lives to have real societal or social or environmental impact. We're talking about market creation. And so you're moving beyond what's about just trying to figure out, what job did you hire Milkshake for and how can we improve it? It's really about trying to create these new experiences for people in the world. And so if you go on the next slide, so in summary, and I'll hand it off to Eric after this, but for market creation and impact ventures in particular, lean startup is disastrous. Eric will dive deeper into some of these in the next section. But one of the things that we see, and we've seen through our research and our work over the years, is that lean startup digs a deep financial hole that makes it near impossible to credibly hit required hurdle rates. And we'll talk about why hurdle rates as a concept are really important even for impact ventures, even ones that are donor funded initially. And then the other piece is just like extremely high failure rate. With an N of 1 or even an N of 5, the failure is almost guaranteed. You'll be chasing money constantly to try to keep piloting and experimenting. Let's say some of our leading examples of social impact ventures or environmental ventures, you'll see this in them. They're constantly, they're just saying it's another year. We just need donor funds to prop us up. They're stuck in this cycle. And then from that, the likelihood of solving the societal problem, it's really tiny. It's minuscule. Even if you strike gold, the amount of money you spent on it, the amount of waste, the amount of opportunity cost, the resources, it's enormous. So, so from here, I'll hand it back over to Eric, and he'll dive a little bit more into some of these concepts.
Yeah, what I wanted to just close the analysis was really come back to the concept of patient capital and just explain how it's kind of caught up in this problem. I mean, you can already kind of see the direction where this goes, but there's this entrenched view that patient capital is it's essential to impact ventures. And I think the logic is that it can de-risk a new market by funding kind of the front end of otherwise kind of this lean startup method. So we can fund the development of an MVP, we can get a pilot test out there. And the belief is that in so doing, creating this initial proof of technology and some market demand, that it's de-risking. But the reality is that patient capital used in this way isn't de-risking the venture. In many ways, it's actually increased the risk at the venture level. And that's because the founder or the startup team, is now saddled with a real operating business. They've got some customers, they've got employees, they may have commission sales agents, office space, supplier relationships, they've got brand recognition, but it's almost certainly losing money. And the problem is, if you don't find money really quickly to sustain the money losing business, you're going to lose everything you just built: the customers, the employees, the commission salespeople, the office space, the brand recognition. And they've all been told that there's this mindset that forms, that, well, experimentation is just a natural part of the process. So they're in the mindset that we just need more time to experiment. So they really get emotionally locked in on the venture. And the big outstanding question is, well, where does that cash come from to sustain now kind of this money losing business once the patient capital runs out? Well, it's not going to come from mainstream commercial capital, like banks, because for them, an unprofitable business, it's not a de-risked asset. It's a liability. You're not going to get, unless you're in some very niche special market, you're not going to attract mainstream VC money. So the money's going to have to come from either your pitching angels, family offices. You could be hunting for grants. And during all of that pitching that you're doing, you're going to be selling the story that you're sitting on a profitable opportunity that just needs another few years of experimentation. And that just locks the team even further into this path. Almost like politically, you're committing to your funders that we have an answer. But again, the problem is it's likely a dead-end path, because chances are just really high that they're working from an architecture that harbors this cost-to-value barrier. But the whole patient capital thinking, it creates another blind spot. It's almost like a technical blind spot. And it's a blind spot in terms of the time value of money. Let me explain what I mean here in a little bit more detail. So the reality is that if we want any of these ventures to truly scale and solve, big societal problems, like, it is going to take commercial capital. I mean, there is just not enough concessionary capital out there to do this. But the world of commercial capital is ruled by the time value of money, which means, money that's made in the future is worth less than it is today. And it shows up practically, when we're calculating returns on cash flows, doing kind of a evaluation, we adjust future cash flows, to their present value using a hurdle rate. And it's very easy. It's very easy when we start with we need to be patient mindset to overlook this erosive force that time value of money has. And you can easily dig this financial hole that is just almost impossible to get out of in order to generate those commercially required returns. And I created this, maybe move this guy forward here. I've created a little example just to illustrate this of how slippery the slope is with being patient and waiting for the future in order to get profits. And so I kind of cooked up this little investment scenario. Again, it's just to be illustrative. I tried to keep everything kind of pretty straightforward and simple and not get bogged down into details. But even with that, looking at spreadsheets is never a fun exercise on a webinar. So I'm going to kind of peel back these layers to help it make it a little easier to interpret. So the scenario is this, we're looking at a venture opportunity and we're saying like, look, in the future, we think this is a $500 million business. And in 10 years, we can get there. We can be at $500 million and we can have a 10% net profit margin. So we can generate 50 million of profits each year. But again, it's going to take us about 10 years and we're going to need 50 million up front, in order to get this going. That's the pitch to the investor, whether if you're in a company, the CFO, or you're going to a commercial lending. And we know that we've got to return some cash to the person. And we know that kind of this type of new ventures, higher risk. So, I put in here like a 20% hurdle rate. No, that's lower than what you would expect from a conventional VC when we're looking probably at 10x within the time frame they're looking at is almost more like a 40%. But I built this with a 20% hurdle rate. So what happens from years 11 onwards? What ends up happening is we've got coming in steady. We're saying like we've got $500 million of revenue, 50 million of profits coming in perpetuity. And I guess the first thing I just want to show is like the impact of time value of money on these profits. Because in my experience, I would say most entrepreneurs, but also a lot of managers inside of corporates, you would look at this and you would think, wow, I know it's 10 years off, but I needed 50 million, but I'm returning 50 million already in year 11 and year 12. Like certainly, like we're getting to break even pretty quickly here. But when you reflect the time value of money of what those cash flows are, brought back to present value, 50 million of profit in year 11 at a 20% hurdle rate is only worth 6.7 million. And you see what happens as you go further out. Those profits in year 20, those 50 million are worth 1.3 million. So very, very big chunk of value is lost when you bring it back to present value. And then when we look at what actually is the actual return, against that hurdle rate, and the way you do that is by calculating, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the net present value. We basically add up the present value of all your cash going out and the present value of cash coming in. And if the number at the end, is positive in this cell here, it means we've exceeded the hurdle rate. And so in this case, we're at, the net present value is 51 million. And the effective, interest rate that it returns is actually 25%. So, we look at that and like, well, okay, well, we've made the hurdle rate. But I just want to point one thing out, just a really key thing, that if you look at this line, this shows the NPV that it's cumulative. It shows where the NPV is, across all these years. So in year 11, for example, I have 46.7 million of present value profits, against my 50 million money going out. So my net present value in year 11 is negative 43 million. Just notice that this thing stays negative net present value up through year 20, and the whole thing kind of works out because of this terminal value, which is a way you capture all those profits that are coming in perpetuity out in the future. So if the CFO or the investor is looking at this, the thing that's going to cross their minds is like, so I'm going to put 50 million into a venture that essentially depends on all the profits that are happening in years 21 and out. The whole thing is based on that. So I guess, how comfortable do you think someone would be in the success of this if the actual commercial returns depend on 20 plus years out of cash flows? But that's still not the end of the whole story. This is what we would call kind of the crystal ball scenario, because we're assuming that this is almost like a machine that we're going to buy, that we pay 50 million for it and it's going to give us these cash flows all moving out. If you're evaluating this, you would do what someone would call, you would adjust these cash flows to reflect kind of probabilities. And so, a probability weighted cash flows is just the way that you can almost think about capturing the cost of all the failures that are going to happen. And so, you adjust the actual cash flows that are coming in. So when you do that and you say like, all right, well, let's take a 20% probability of success, on these cash flows, which, going back to Patrick's, slides about what's the actual success rates of, probably under 2%, 20% is phenomenal. But look what happens already to our NPV. The NPV goes negative. The effective IRR for these cash flows now becomes 13%. And in order to get it back up to 20, instead of a $500 million opportunity, we would need to have an $800 million opportunity. So we need, a huge increase in actually the size of the market that we're serving to get this thing back to profit, to hitting our hurdle returns. Take a 10% probability success. Again, still, that's phenomenal, in today's world of where success rates are. The IRR, drops to 9%. Required revenue to get this thing back up to 20, swells to 1.6 billion. And if we get down here to 5% probability of success, you see what happens. We're down to a 6% IRR. We need 3.2 billion in order to generate enough free cash flow to make up for all of this. So the moral of the story is that, the longer you take to get the profitability, the higher we're just raising the bar on the startup to generate commercial returns. So it's like this patience mindset, it's really stacking the deck against everybody, and it's increasing the need for capital. We're manufacturing a capital dependency by telling people and encouraging them to kind of use this approach. And whereas the message should actually just be literally the opposite. Clay Christensen has said this before about the whole disruptive innovation solution. It's like, you need to be impatient for profits, not patient for profitability. So, okay. Just, the takeaway then from this kind of analysis we do, the problem analysis today, is just that, if you're building problems to solve, big problems at scale, this way of searching, experimenting, looking for profitability, by running a business live in market, it is just a non-starter. It is, you dig a financial hole that you can't get out of. And was never built or meant to solve the problem that it's being used for in an impact venture context, where ultimately the goal is, we want enduringly profitable scaled ventures. We're not looking for the big exit. We're actually looking for enduring profitability. So, and this is our segue will be to next time, is that given that objective, the innovation method has to be aligned with it. And for us to deliver on that objective in a way that we can actually generate the commercial returns that will allow us to actually achieve scale, we've got to drive up success rates. We can't be down in the low single digits. We got to drive down the validation time and the amount of cash going out. We can't be running and experimenting for 10 plus years, burning 40% of loss on revenues, just trying to figure out whether or not this thing will even work or not. We just need to completely flip the way we're currently innovating today. All right. this is the point in time I was going to bring Otto into the conversation, but as I said, unfortunately, we don't have him today. So, but what that does, it gives us an opportunity to kind of open up, and we can take our last 15 minutes and just address some questions. Yeah. So next week, like I said, we'll shift from this mode of like from problem definition mode to saying like, well, what do you do now? And it fundamentally is flipping this key thing that Patrick shared of like this ingrained way of saying we've got to search, we got to search and experiment to get through this uncertainty. I would say, think of it instead as like, we build a solution that can absorb, we can anticipate and then absorb a lot of uncertainty. We can absorb higher costs. We can absorb lower demand. It's what, again, it's the way an engineer builds. Like I build the roof of my house to hold, and deal with a lot of unexpected things. I don't build it based off of like, well, in the last 1 or 2 years, this is the amount of snowfall we have. We build it in order to absorb a lot of uncertainty. And it's this mindset that we bring into the actual venture design process. And so what we'll talk about in the solution are really these kind of 3 key pillars. And we call it FIT startup, and it's an acronym. So one, we're going to look at 2 really fundamental financial vital signs. We're going to look going back to having a clear profitability objective function that's guiding the entire process through. We'll talk about 2. And the whole focus of design is these 2 financial metrics that will literally determine what's your chance of being profitable at launch. And then how you do that, we're going to look, preemptively looking for where are there the structural profit barriers that are today otherwise going to sink us, when we launch, and figuring out how do we innovate around them and circumvent them, not how do we optimize them. And then lastly, and this gets back to the whole, the point I was leaving you on about being able to evaluate whether something works, we've got to build out what we call a testable train of logic. If it's not clear what you're actually solving for, simply saying like, well, we think, a direct to consumer sales force, and having a lot of consumer engagement will be necessary to sell this product. Like, I can't evaluate that because I have no real clarity about like what's the science base on what that is driven by. So we're going to talk about how do you actually share out and what is the science base, and we'll share with you a framework that we've developed that's got 10 pieces of 10 structural profit barriers and a logic chain kind of around each of them that we use to guide ventures to go through and build something that's robust. All right, I'll pause there.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. We will release a recording of this session, as well as a recording of the next session if you can't make it. But we very much look forward to talking to you again in a week's time. Thank you for your time here today.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.